Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, the Game Master, and in this one, we're going to be talking a little bit about the very end of a massive event that DC did called Blackest Night. And at the very tail end of it, what happens then is we get kind of this second event called Brightest Day. And that brought in the idea of the White Lantern Corps. But before we get into that, smash that like button, check to make sure you're still subscribed, and as always, leave us a comment. That helps us out on our end with the YouTube algorithm, but also we love hearing from you guys. We have an awesome community here, and that's thanks to you. So thank you so much for being here. So, all right, all that said, let's start talking about Brightest Day. Brightest Day in the comics, and I'm going to talk about what happened in the comics, and then I'm going to talk about what we did in our game because I feel like it has to be in that order. If I tell you what we did in our game, you're going to be like, well, that doesn't have anything to do with the comics. Like, what are you doing? Well, I'm going to talk about what happened in the comics and why I didn't like it. And also why we had already had things happen just because of the nature of gaming, right? The random rolls of the dice means that things are not going to happen the way they happened in the comics. For that matter, in the comics, a lot of characters survive the Blackest Night story because of plot armor, right? It's not a game. Nobody's really fighting or whatever. It's just the writer saying, well, I want this guy to win. So he wins, right? With us having to follow rules and actual game mechanics and logic and stuff like that, a bunch of people died, right? I mean, it wasn't even funny. It was like all the superheroes died practically. Certainly not 100%, but I mean, it changed the face of our game world forever. That's, I'm not overselling that. It really did. It was everything I've talked about so far on this channel ends with Blackest Night. It really does. It was a huge bookend for what had just been how our game worked. It completely derailed everything we were doing. We just got wrecked. But again, I'm talking about our game. Let me go back to the comics for a minute. So, in the comics, the Black Lanterns are just running loose. They're causing all sorts of problems. And they start to talk about this idea of somehow, we now have established we've got the Roy G. Biv thing going on. There are red lanterns, orange lanterns, yellow lanterns, green lanterns, blue lanterns, indigo lanterns, and violet lanterns. And so they're saying, all right, that's all the colors of the rainbow. We're going to kind of do that prism thing, where you put all the colors together and what comes out the other side of the prism is the white light, right? So there's going to be a white lantern corps, and they're going to be able to do everything that all the other lanterns did. So whereas some of the different colored cores had certain properties, like for instance, I mentioned in the last video that the blue lanterns are really good at healing and stuff like that, right? And the other guys, not so much. So because of that, the white lanterns would therefore be really good at healing. They can do everything everybody else can do. And for that matter, I mean the orange lantern by himself, there's just one of them. The orange lantern ring is practically the infinity gauntlet. So the idea that a white ring can do even more than that, right? It was just blowing everybody's mind. I felt like, for me anyways, I felt like not since the Crisis on Infinite Earths was DC Comics kind of selling us on this idea that it was just the biggest thing ever, and you couldn't believe the scope of what was going on. And I mentioned this before, I had quit reading comic books at one point. Part of it was I owned a comic book store, and when I went out of business because of issues with the local economy, no other stores sprung up to take my place. So there was kind of no place to buy comic books now with me gone. So that was one reason I wasn't reading comic books, right? But the other thing was when I would go to like Walden Books at the mall or something like that, and they started carrying comics more than they had before because of me going under. Even then, it was still kind of just like a spinner rack or something. It was like really, really minor. Um, I was looking at some stuff there and I wasn't liking any of it hardly, you know? But then when they did the Sinestro Core War, it got my attention. And then when they brought in the red lanterns, orange lanterns, so on and so forth, indigo lanterns, violet lanterns, it I started to read it. It was one of those few things where I came back and I cared. And I was like, maybe I'll go back to being a comic book fan again now. And they kept pitching the idea of this White Lantern man. He's going to be so powerful. He's just going to be the ultimate thing. And I remember my one friend, this is sort of a brief aside, but it will illustrate where we were at mentally, right? What our expectations were. So back in like around 1997, they did this big event called Marvel versus DC. And a lot of stuff happened in that event. I'm not going to really talk about it, but they created these two cosmic beings. And one of them was the embodiment of the DC universe, and the other one was the embodiment of the Marvel universe. And they kind of looked like robotic, and they were just huge, these huge dudes. And in the story, it seems like they are greater than any other cosmic being in either universe. So whether in DC we're talking about like the Spectre, who is like God's angel of wrath, right? Or whether you're talking about like in Marvel, you've got characters like Galactus, devourer of worlds, you know what I mean? These two huge dudes, the red guy and the blue guy, they just seem to dwarf everybody else. So my one friend was utterly and completely convinced that the guy who was the giant robotic dude that was the embodiment of the DC universe, he was convinced he was going to become the White Lantern. And his thinking behind that was, he is sort of the guy in continuity who's depicted as this ultimate being. And the White Lanterns are being, they're trying to sell us on this idea that they're the ultimate thing ever. Infinity Gauntlet level stuff. And also like at one point in the story, Hal Jordan, aka the Green Lantern, Carol Ferris, aka the Violet Lantern slash Star Sapphire, and Sinestro Thal, right, who is a Yellow Lantern, they find the White Lantern power battery, which is what I'm using for the channel art in this video. They find the battery in this crater in the middle of nowhere, basically, right? And Hal tries to physically lift the power battery and can't. And so they even start talking about King Arthur and how this is the new sword in the stone, right? And so they're saying if we are not worthy to even lift this battery, who is? And so that just goes to show it's this little moment in the story that shows you how they kept building up these expectations. at least with me and my circle of friends. I won't talk about anybody else because I'm sure there's a ton of guys listening to this who um had their own thoughts on the story or whatever. I'm not trying to talk about that. I'm just talking about where I was at. I'm talking about where my friends were at. So we had these impossibly high expectations of this story. And at this point now, we've been buying issue after issue after issue, and they've been dragging it out for so long with this promise of what we assume is going to be. It's kind of like going to see fireworks on the 4th of July and you're expecting a grand finale, right? And so we had invested our time, our our money buying issues. We had bothered to care when we had quit caring about comics. There's all this momentum. And then the ending, in my opinion, was like a freaking joke. And the punchline was Swamp Thing. And we were so let down by that. And again, if you're a Swamp Thing fan, more power to you, right? I don't like Swamp Thing. I don't like Man Thing either from Marvel. I just always thought their powers were boring. They just do nothing for me at all. And neither of them strike me as the ultimate being, right? Some cosmic thing that is just so above everybody else. I've never thought that. I think of them as swamp monsters, you know? And and then the kick in the teeth is it's not even really Swamp Thing. And let me explain that real quick. So I watched the Swamp Thing movies back when I was a kid. One of them had Heather Locklear. That was the first thing I ever saw her in, and I was like, "Holy crap, Heather Locklear!" So that's why I watched that movie. And then I think the other one had Adrienne Barbeau. And when I watched the movie, my understanding was that there was a scientist, and he's in a swamp doing science crap. His name is Alec Holland. Hijinks ensue. He dies, and his body's in the water, and there's chemicals in the water. And by the way, um, I used to be friends. He's no longer with us, sadly, but I used to be friends with a guy named David Wise, and he actually wrote the majority of the 1987 Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles cartoon. David Wise wrote more episodes than anybody else, and he wrote the pilot. And in the pilot of that cartoon, I'm mentioning this for a reason. In the pilot to the cartoon, they introduce us to this glowing mutagen ooze. And the way it works is whatever living thing you last touched, the ooze will mutate you from what you currently are into something approaching that other organism, right? And so the turtles had been handled by a human being named Hamato Yoshi, and therefore, since the last living thing that touched him was human, the turtles all became more human. And of course, they're not totally human, they're sort of halfway there, right? Well, I mentioned that because that was my understanding with Swamp Thing. I thought Alec Holland got shot or whatever. I couldn't even tell you now what happened to him, and that he's in the water and there's all this swamp crap, right? And because those are the living things he's in contact with, the chemicals mutated his body. And then now Alec Holland is Swamp Thing. That was my understanding. And Swamp Thing appears in the DC Heroes role playing game. And in the game, that's how they treat it. If you look at his character sheet and you look at his alter ego, they list it as Alec Holland. They're saying he is Alec Holland. That's always how I thought it went. Well, then in Brightest Day, the writer kind of takes you in a different direction. And he says that's not what happened at all. Here's what really happened. Alec Holland is a scientist. He is in a swamp doing science crap. He he dies, right? But his soul goes to heaven. And the soul is what is really Alec Holland. The body, he has shed his mortal coil. He no longer needs his old, former physical body. That gets possessed by some magical thing that has something to do with plant life. It's like the spirit of plants or something, right? That is what Swamp Thing is. So the irony is, forget about Swamp Thing for a minute. Alec Holland, the soul of Alec Holland in heaven, it like it's never gone adventuring. It's never done anything heroic, right? He's just some science dude. And he's the guy then that becomes the White Lantern. So again, to reiterate, my friends and I thought it was going to be some cosmic being, or like we thought maybe the Spectre was going to become the new White Lantern or something. We didn't know. We didn't know where they were going with it. And nobody I knew liked how that ended. We hated it. And we were just like, holy crap, dude. Like, how much money did we collectively spend on all these issues? Mind you, they had tie-in merchandise. So, like, we were actually wearing White Lantern rings, like in real life, little plastic White Lantern ring toys. We'd spent a lot of money kind of buying into this idea and buying into the hype and everything. And we were just like, typical comic book industry, you got us. You tricked us. And then the other thing is they were doing all this crap for so long. And Brightest Day is then 2010, right? Well, what happens right after that? Flashpoint. And I guarantee that the editorial staff at DC Comics knew exactly what they were doing well in advance. And they do Flashpoint. And then when Flashpoint is over, which is a Flash story involving him using time travel to change everything, after that is over with, the entire continuity, the old continuity, is just trashed. They throw it all away. All of their promises, everything that you cared about, all gets thrown in the trash. And they just say, meh, we're starting over. We're starting over. And Batman's like 18 years old. And he's like fighting crime for the first time. And Superman's young and he's kind of a prick and, so on and so forth. It's the new edgelord Justice League. That's a bit much, but clearly I was not a fan, right? I felt like they pulled the rug out from under me. A lot of people did. New 52 certainly has millions of haters, you know. Um, but it particularly sucked when you were so invested in the stuff that was happening in the comics. And it's like, oh my God, Barry Allen is a Blue Lantern now. And wow, this is amazing. And there was this little moment of time where for me, it was like just the ultimate DC, you know? And for this little moment there, I was so happy and I loved what was going on. And then the moment passed. So, and then the other thing is, I don't know. I keep wanting to call him Swamp Thing. Alec Holland, the Alec Holland White Lantern. I can't even. And first of all, they build him up, and then like I feel like I never saw him ever again. So there's that. Um, they did a thing too with Deadman. There's this character in DC called Deadman, aka Boston Brand, and he died. It's kind of like his origin story. And so he's like a ghost that floats around and he can possess people and yada yada yada. And at any rate, they brought him back to life. And I thought that was really cool. And I'm like, oh, we're gonna, they're gonna do something with Dead Man, and he's gonna be like a really big deal. And that just fizzled out, you know? And then they wasted so much time on dumb stuff. Like they introduced a new Aqualad, and I didn't like them. They sort of take the name of the character and some of the character concepts and they kind of fixed it. And then they put that on the Young Justice cartoon, and I loved him on the Young Justice cartoon, but I thought he was just kind of worthless in Brightest Day. And then at the same time, I was just like, why are we talking about Aquaman related characters and not this ultimate being that you guys keep teasing? You know what I mean? Like, I'm assuming that your new Aqualad is not the ultimate being, so maybe let's shelf that and go back to talking about things that actually matter. Um, but yeah, clearly I'm bitter. I'll try to rein it in. Well, so we didn't like it. Oh, I was gonna say, and then just all the people who died, and you were like, oh my God, I can't believe so and so died. They just bring them all back willy-nilly, because of White Lantern, whatever plot convenience and stuff. And I hated it all. I hated the whole thing. And at the end of the day, I felt like, what a piece of crap. The ending ruins it all. What a piece of crap story. And here I sort of wrecked my entire game world over this piece of crap story. So we tried to salvage it. First of all, even if I wanted to try to follow the story, I couldn't because the characters who are heroes in the comic died in our game. Because if you have something like, and I mentioned this, I think, in the last video, but if you have like Black Lantern Superman fighting Jimmy Olsen, and they're saying, "Oh, look how shocking it is that he's willing to hurt those that he once loved," that works in a zombie movie when one of your characters can't push planets and the other guy can't, right? The other guy is not going to just hit him with a ball bat and run away and go hide in a car or something. Like that is not how this works, right? Black Lantern Superman can just throw the car in the sun, and when Jimmy dies, he's a Black Lantern. Like, yeah. So even if I wanted to tell their story, I couldn't at this point because everybody was dead. So it this well, let me back up a little bit here too. Say another thing about our game world. So something else that was really interesting about this, and I think it had an effect on me on why I was buying into it so much. And if you follow my channel, you already know that the character of Nekron has been a long-running villain. We used him way more in our game than DC ever did, right? And so when all this started, my friends kept sending me emails and stuff and contacting me in social media like, are you seeing what they're doing with Nekron? Like he's like a huge deal. Like this seems so up your alley. So that was having an effect on me, right? They were doing stuff in the comics that just so happened to be kind of reinventing the wheel of what I'd done in my game. Well, so in my game previously, before I was even the game master, Greg Sheets ran a game where there was a Green Lantern that encounters this device, this gadget that ends up removing the yellow impurity from his ring. And he becomes a Blue Lantern. And Greg ran that in the 80s. So we had Blue Lanterns in our game in the 80s. Um, my best friend in college was a guy named Kelson Barber, and he was playing a Green Lantern for a while. And we did an adventure where he had encountered a Red Lantern, and they fought in sort of the town square of like our local town where we live. And so I had already set up this idea that I was in art school. I had to take a class called color theory. And I remember we had to like paint a color wheel, but then we had to like import other colors into it, somehow. I literally made my color wheel all like Green Lantern symbols. And so it'd be like a big Green Lantern symbol for the green sort of pie slice, the color wheel. And then in the center circle of the thing, I made a little like a yellow lantern symbol inside of it because the Green Lanterns had a weakness to yellow, right? And so with each one, so like my Red Lanterns had a problem with the color purple then, right? And like so on and so forth. I went through and I figured out, each one would have a weakness to the color right next to them on the color wheel. So I had already come up with this idea in 1995. And then the other thing was in the game, they were talking about how do we somehow merge these rings and make a white ring. So it was crazy. I mean, obviously there's differences because in the comics, like the Red Lanterns don't have a weakness to the color purple, for instance, right? That's one difference. But all this other stuff, they were doing what I had already talked about doing. And I hadn't introduced every colored ring. I just had never gotten around to it. And I had never merged them into a white ring. And then when all this crap is hitting the fan, the various John Redbridges, because Kelson's character, his Green Lantern character, died in 1997, and we established there had been a game where the one guy was training a bunch of rookie Green Lanterns. In that game, we had established where the old power batteries and rings and stuff like that were. So so at any rate, these various guys, all the John Redbridges, start grabbing power rings. And then the other thing is we established there's this comic book where Kyle Rayner goes back in time and meets Hal Jordan, and it's a young Hal Jordan who sort of hears about all the parallax stuff. And so young Hal Jordan has the ability, you can sort of hold a power ring in your hands and concentrate, and it will split and become two rings. And so then Hal keeps one and he gives the other one to Kyle and says, now go back to the future and bring back the Green Lantern Corps. Now that you know the trick, now that you know how to make more rings, do it, right? Well, so we'd established that in that old rookie Green Lantern game. So therefore, guys are grabbing stuff like a red ring and turning it into two red rings, and they, so on and so forth. They grab a yellow ring and make two rings, and then they take those two rings and make four rings, and. So we've got the whole spectrum of colors for the John Redbridges. And also, if you follow the channel, we have certainly seen the character because he's been in so many games over a 40-year period. In terms of the red is anger and rage and stuff. We've seen him do that. We've seen him enraged and doing stuff in adventures. Orange is wanting more power. We saw that in the Infinity Gauntlet saga, right? Um, Yellow is striking fear in your enemies. We've certainly seen that. On and on, right? So we were like, they're all able to use every ring. And so when everybody's dying around them, the Red Bridges finally merge the rings physically. Like if we can get them to come apart, if we can make two rings become well, I'm sorry, I misspoke. If we can take one like green ring and make it turn into two green rings, right? We're going to take like a this ring and that ring, and we're going to merge them. And then we're going to take these two rings over here and we're going to merge them. And then we're going to take those two merged rings and we're going to merge them, right? And they kept doing that until they had the white ring. And so the original John Redbridge, because the others, well, I don't want to go off on a big tangent about it. The point is, so we get our White Lantern John Redbridge. And now to us, this felt so right because, first of all, the white ring is supposed to be all about life, and not just life as in like you're alive or something like that, but like, for instance, at one point, Dead Man, Boston Brand, has a white ring, and the ring is talking to him. And it's telling him stuff like, take time to eat a cheeseburger. It literally is telling him, like, go get a cheeseburger. And Boston Brand is sort of like, shouldn't we be dealing with all this crazy crap that's going wrong in the world? And the ring's like, we will, but kind of like, take time to smell the roses. Like, go get a cheeseburger. You've been dead for a long time. You haven't tasted a cheeseburger in forever. Go eat a cheeseburger, dude. And at one point, the ring was talking about, you remember so and so? It was like our first love, you know? And so it's not just the ring of the living, you know what I mean? As in not dead or the opposite of undead, but it's as in your life. Like when you look back on your life and you look at the big moments in your life and you look at all of those emotions and everything, that's what the white ring is supposed to be about. And so we'd seen all those emotions in John Redbridge. And and then not only that, if you go back to the very beginning of my channel, right? He when he arrives on Earth in ancient times and the Irish call him Dagda, he was the god of life and fertility, which is, of course, he's creating more life. And we have ad nauseum said that the John Redbridges have basically hooked up with all the superheroines of the world and reformed several female supervillains. And and all of these different John Redbridges are having kids. They're creating life, right? And on top of everything else I've said, we played up Nekron as the archenemy. And for years, when DC Comics wasn't using Nekron, he was like the main bad guy in our game. And his primary sparring partner was John Redbridge. And just to us, it was an overwhelming no brainer that this guy has wielded the Infinity Gauntlet. He's done this, he's done that. And when we would have these various crises, whether it was Darkseid attacking around the year 1970, and like we rolled up, we rolled dice, everybody else failed. The guy who took out Darkseid was Redbridge, right? The Crisis on Infinite Earths, who took out the Anti-Monitor. When everybody else tried and failed, Redbridge did it. Time and again, he's the guy. Time and again, he's the one being in our entire universe that repeatedly saves the universe, right? And we just thought it doesn't get better than that. We thought he was an absolute perfect fit. So so now we've got White Lantern John Redbridge. It's too bad his last name's Redbridge. We did that long before this story um was published. It's kind of weird when he's the White Lantern, but his name's not like White Bridge or whatever. But yeah, at any rate, so they fight, and we have and at this point, almost everybody who played the game, like if it's like my son playing Terry McGinnis and he dies, you know, at the hands of his own father, Bruce Wayne, who's zombie Bruce Wayne, all this awful stuff had been happening. The players had been trying and trying, not getting anywhere, right? And one of the things that I'm a big believer in the idea of a GMPC. And I've always said over the years, at the end of the day, it's the safety net. That if you get to the point where the heroes, the actual player characters, have failed So much that it's going to be the end of the game world, and we won't be able to keep playing the game. As an absolute last resort, I bring in the GMPC. And that's why we have all these stories, by the way, with he killed Darkseid, he killed the Anti-Monitor, so on and so forth, right? So I said, okay, it's time to bring in the GMPC. And I asked my friend, I said, Tag, you're the GM. Put me in, coach. And everybody was just like, yeah, because like I never get to play. And as the guy who's been the game master forever now, I know all the rules. I know how to abuse the rules. I know all the loopholes in the rules. Like, if I really am like, let's go, the players got excited. I'll put it that way. Maybe you had to be there, but they were just like, yeah. And my wife actually played the Touch from Transformers the movie because I'm a big fan of that. And it's this big moment in Transformers the movie. It's the death of Optimus Prime, actually, but it's Optimus Prime versus Megatron, and they play the Touch. And so she's like playing that, and we start to roll the dice, and it's like, cool, man. We're finally doing White Lantern John Redbridge versus Black Lantern Nekron. It's the arch enemies. It's like Batman versus Joker, Superman versus Lex Luthor. It's epic, and they fight. And so White Lantern Redbridge, because Necron has this hole in his chest as if he's had an autopsy or something. You can see his like undead heart. And so he just reaches in, rips out the heart, crushes it in his hand, and there's like white light, like burns the heart away into nothing. And Necron seems to die. And everybody's like, yay. But then a random zombie turns into a new Necron. And really quick, because we mentioned Swamp Thing earlier, there's a thing with Swamp Thing. Like, if you were to like completely disintegrate his body, then some other nearby plant will grow into a new Swamp Thing. And at one point, there was a story where it was space in the distant future, and there was like no plant life left in the universe. But there was a starship captain had like a wooden, like a coffee table in his quarters, and he kills Swamp Thing. So Swamp Thing was able to grow, like the wood of the table comes back to life, and he was able to grow out of that, right? So it turns out Necron does a very similar thing, where if you kill Necron's physical form, he regrows from something nearby. And in this case, it was one of the random zombies running around in this whole big zombie apocalypse, right? So we're like, well, crap, that's a problem. And so they just fight and fight and fight and fight. And it's like Necron's doing a little bit of damage, but hardly any at all. And then on my turns, I'm taking the Omni power I get from the White Lantern ring. I substitute it for regeneration. I'm getting my lost hit points back. And so we're just fighting and fighting and fighting and fighting. And it's just knock down, drag out thing, and nothing's working. And finally, I say, wait a minute. Like I've been doing this for years and years and years and years now. I've been doing this entirely the wrong way. And so on my turn, I say, I want to substitute the power of the white ring, the omni power, for regeneration usable on others. And I'm going to use that on Necron. I want to heal this thing that is the embodiment of death and the undead and sickness and decay and all that stuff, right? Let's see how he likes the white light of healing. And I did that to him, and he screams. It's like matter and antimatter, right? And and I healed him to death. That was how we handled it. And in our game world, Necron, who had been the ultimate big bad guy for years, ever since the first time I played the game in high school with my high school friends, Necron had been the primary villain of the entire game world, and he died forever. We've never brought him back. And as soon as he was gone, That was the linchpin. Go after the central black power battery. We destroy that. That's the power source for all these Black Lanterns. We, again, we were running this at the same time that they were making the comics. So we went out on a limb. I've still never seen this in a comic book anywhere, but we went out on a limb that all of the Lantern cores would therefore have a 24-hour charge. That if the Green Lanterns need to charge their rings once every 24 hours, the black ones do too. And so therefore, they've only got 24 hours left. And the time is up, and they just go back to being corpses. Because that's one of the things the rings do, is they are animating this corpse. And the thing there too, because we're talking about the opposites between the White Lanterns and the Black Lanterns. Whereas in the comics, like I said, the White Ring actually gets the soul of Alec Holland to make him sort of the main dude. Um, that's not what the Black Lanterns do. So like when you're fighting Black Lantern Superman, there is no soul. The ring is just kind of working the former body like a puppet, but it's like a soulless puppet. You know what I mean? And even when they have memories, that's just because the corpse still has those chemicals in its head or whatever that the physical memory engrams that it has access to. Um, which that's going to come up in a later story where we have the zombie version of John Redbridge, and the soul of John Redbridge is elsewhere, but his body becomes a zombie, and it has his memories. You know, we did the same thing there again. That's a story for another day. Um, but yeah, that was how we handled this. Was we healed him to death, and once you took out Nekron, and then you took out the central black power battery, it was like dominoes. And then it was much easier for the White Lantern to go around and just start dealing with everything. And one thing though was, like I said, we're not gonna promise something and not stick to it. It was just the end of our game world as you knew it. So many characters died. And the way we were running the Black Lanterns was, like I said, if Black Lantern Superman were to kill whoever, I don't know, Jimmy Olsen or somebody, as soon as Jimmy's dead, he gets a black ring and gets up and he's part of the Black Lantern army now. Um, so many characters died. It just wiped the entire slate clean. And we felt like we were really screwed and we didn't know what we were going to do because our game had always been about DC and Marvel characters. And now they were gone. And so we were like, do we just run original characters? Because we could do that. We just make up a new character. Because it's not like all life in the universe got extinguished or something. Like the normal people were kind of fine. The Black Lanterns were sort of going in order of priority. Like, let's start with the supers, because if we don't take them out, if we don't kind of surprise attack them, they could rise up against us later and win. So take out the biggest threat first. So therefore, Joe Blow on the street is fine, and he can just get struck by lightning and get super speed or whatever. You know what I mean? So for sure, we kept playing, but there was a little period here between here and what I will call, like in the comics, they did New 52. We referred to our version as Old 52. And it was the kids who lived. Anytime I was describing a Black Lantern killing anybody, it was never ever a kid. Just because it was just sort of my sensibilities as the game master. So we realized we'd left ourselves an open door there, that there were all these offspring in the world. And like, for instance, there was an Avengers animated movie that they made. I can't remember what it was called, like A Next or something like that. But like there was a kid in it that was like the son of Captain America and Black Widow. He was the leader, and his name might have been James because I think Cap named him after Bucky. And then it's like I don't know, like Ant-Man and Wasp had a kid, and so on and so forth. I think there was a kid of Storm and Black Panther, but you get the gist, right? And so ultimately, that's where this would go in 2011. We're just not quite there yet. And then between those two events, when we were still figuring out what we wanted to do, we decided to do our version, which was kind of like a riff on Marvel's Secret Invasion, which is where the Skrulls show up and are kind of committing identity theft in a way against famous superheroes. So you have like Skrull Iron Man and Skrull Thor and stuff like that. And so we ran that also right after Blackest Night when all the characters were missing. And then the general public didn't even know these weren't the original heroes, right? So, but again, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll save that for tomorrow's video. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you guys. If you liked this video and you want to support the channel, you know the routine, right? Smash like, make sure you're subscribed, and leave us a comment. And from all of us here at the longest running superhero role playing game on earth, we hope you have a good one, and we'll catch you in the next adventure. Bye.